The barn smelled of dust, old hay, and sweat. 100 voices murmured, rising and falling like restless waves against the cracked wooden beams. The auctioneer's hammer struck down again, his voice sharp and hollow, bouncing through the rafters as number after number passed. Horses, tools, livestock, everything seemed to have a buyer. But when the thin, trembling dog limped into the ring, the room grew strangely quiet. His ribs pressed against his skin like fragile bones trying to break free, his fur matted with dirt and dried blood. One ear hung low, torn from some forgotten fight, and his eyes, those dark, bottomless eyes, didn't plead anymore. They had given up. The auctioneer cleared his throat, forced a laugh that cracked in the silence, and began the call. "We'll start me at 20. Just 20, folks." No hands lifted. Not one. He dropped lower. 10. Still nothing. The crowd shifted in their seats, avoiding his gaze, the way people do when guilt presses too hard. The dog staggered, his legs trembling under the weight of all the years he hadn't lived yet, and the sound of his breathing was louder than the silence. And then, when it seemed he would be led away to whatever unsold meant in this world, a single hand rose at the back of the room. No words, no hesitation. Just one quiet gesture that cut through the stillness like a blade. The first time I saw him, I thought he might collapse before the bidding even began. He limped in from the side gate, a rough rope dragging along the dirt behind him, and the crowd shifted like they weren't sure whether to watch or look away. You could tell, just by the way he moved, that life had been nothing but fight and hunger. His paws barely lifted, scraping against the ground, as if even that was too much to ask. The auctioneer's voice, once booming and fast, slowed. "Here we got one male dog, mixed breed." He hesitated. You could almost hear the thought in his head. This isn't what people came for. He forced a price out into the stale air. $20 to start. The dog didn't even lift his head. His eyes scanned the crowd for something, maybe mercy, maybe just a face that wouldn't turn away. He found none. People stared at the cracks in the wooden floor, at the hats in their hands, at the dust motes dancing in the shafts of light that cut through the high windows. Anywhere but him. I swear you could hear his breathing, ragged and uneven, louder than the shuffle of boots and whispers of cloth. The air thickened with the shame no one wanted to name. The auctioneer's voice cracked as he dropped lower. $10. 5. A cough from the back. A mutter. Someone chuckled nervously. The kind of laugh that isn't joy but discomfort. The dog swayed where he stood, ribs visible, his body leaning like a house about to fall. The silence that followed was suffocating, as though the room itself was holding its breath. That's when it happened. At the far edge of the crowd, a figure shifted. A man, sitting alone, half hidden in the shadow where the light didn't reach. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't move forward. He just lifted his hand, steady, quiet, like he was answering a question no one else had heard. The auctioneer blinked. For a second, he almost didn't believe it. Then relief flooded his face. His hammer fell. Just like that, the dog's fate, whatever it would be, was sealed by a silent hand in the dark. But I remember the way the man stood when he walked forward, how the crowd parted without a word. His boots dragged dust with each step, and his face stayed unreadable, carved from something harder than stone. He didn't look at the others. He didn't look for approval. His eyes fixed only on the dog, and when the rope was passed into his hand, he didn't tug it or force it. He simply held it loose, letting the broken animal choose whether to follow. The dog hesitated, trembled, then took one step, then another, as if drawn by something unseen. The truck was old, the kind that coughed and groaned before the engine finally gave in to motion. Its paint had peeled down to patches of gray, and the windows rattled in their frames. When the man opened the passenger door, the hinges whined in protest, and for a moment, it looked like the dog might refuse. His legs shook as he tried to climb, the kind of trembling that came not just from weakness but from memory. The memory of being dragged, shoved, left behind. The man didn't push him. He didn't whistle or clap or coax. He simply stood there holding the rope loosely, waiting, and somehow, the waiting made all the difference. The dog tested the rusted step with one paw, then another, and finally folded himself into the cracked leather seat. He sagged there, exhausted, his head pressed against the cool window, breaths shallow but steady. The man shut the door softly, more gently than you'd expect from someone with such a heavy frame. He walked around, slid behind the wheel, and for the first time, the two of them shared the small, echoing silence of the cab. The road stretched ahead like a scar through fields of yellow grass. Dust rose behind them, curling in the rearview mirror, erasing the auction barn until it was nothing but memory. The man didn't turn on the radio. He didn't speak. His hands rested firm on the wheel, fingers nicked with scars that told of work and accidents alike. From time to time, his eyes flickered to the dog, not searching for gratitude, not expecting fear, just watching as though memorizing the fragile rise and fall of the creature's chest. The dog shifted once, a low whimper escaping his throat. His paw twitched against the torn seat and his ears pressed back. The man didn't shush him. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket with one hand and laid something small on the dashboard, a square of jerky, wrapped in wax paper. He didn't offer it, didn't hold it under the dog's nose. Just set it there, close enough to smell, far enough to choose. Minutes later, when the dog stretched his neck weakly and licked at the edge, the man didn't smile. He just adjusted his grip on the wheel and drove on. Hours passed. The sun bled into the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of orange and violet. Shadows crept across the cab, wrapping the dog in soft dark. By the time the truck rumbled off the paved road onto gravel, the dog was half asleep, caught between rest and the echo of pain. The house was nothing more than a cabin tucked into the edge of the woods. Its roof slanted with age, and the porch sagged under its own weight, but smoke curled from the chimney, and the glow of lamplight waited behind the windows. The man killed the engine, and silence fell heavy. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then the man pushed his door open, boots crunching against the gravel. He circled to the other side, opened the passenger door, and waited. The dog stirred, blinked against the dim light, then eased himself down, wincing as his paw touched the ground. He froze there, uncertain, swaying like he might collapse. The man didn't touch him. He didn't reach for the rope. He simply stood, steady as a post, until the dog gathered himself and limped toward the porch. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood smoke, old pine, and something faintly metallic. Tools, maybe, or the ghosts of work long abandoned. The man laid an old blanket by the fire and set down a battered metal bowl filled with water. He crouched once, adjusting the blanket, then rose again, letting the dog decide. The dog lowered himself onto the fabric with a groan, his body curling into itself as though afraid it would take up too much space. His eyes half closed, but they never left the man's shadow moving through the room. He tracked every motion. Hands rinsing, kettle set on the stove, boots unlaced at the door. Every sound was catalogued by ears that had learned long ago that silence could turn to violence without warning. The man moved with a strange rhythm, slow, deliberate, without wasted motion. When he finally settled into the chair opposite the fire, he didn't look at the dog. He leaned back, eyes fixed on the flames, arms crossed over his chest. They sat like that for a long time, two figures, both scarred, both silent, the crackle of fire the only bridge between them. Whispers of the town would come later. Folks saying the man had once been something, a soldier, a drifter, a fighter. Others claimed he was just trouble that hadn't burned out yet. But in that cabin, with the night pressing against the windows and the fire painting their faces gold, none of it mattered. What mattered was that neither of them spoke. And in that silence, something fragile began to root. Not trust, not yet, but the faintest possibility of it. Like the first thin stem pushing through frozen ground, invisible to everyone but those who had been waiting for spring. Morning arrived not with birdsong, but with the steady drip of melted frost sliding from the roof onto the porch. The cabin windows glowed faintly, their panes fogged from the heat of the fire that had burned through most of the night. Inside, the dog stirred on the blanket, the stiffness in his joints evident in the way he tried to lift his head, then let it drop again. Every muscle in his body seemed at war with itself. His ribs rose and fell like fragile bellows, and when he shifted, a sharp whine escaped his throat, raw and unmeant. The man was already awake. He moved quietly in the kitchen, boiling water, his frame silhouetted against the faint blue, gray light leaking through the window. The kettle hissed, and he poured the steam into a chipped mug, setting a tabag to bleed its color into the water. His boots were unlaced, his shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, scars mapping his forearms like stories never told. He turned mug in hand and his eyes fell on the dog. He crouched slowly, lowering himself until he was level with the blanket. He didn't reach out. He simply let the dog smell the air between them. The man's breath fogged faintly in the cool morning, his silence steady, patient. Then, without ceremony, he set a small bowl of warm broth beside the dog, its scent drifting through the air. He tapped the edge once with his finger and withdrew. The dog lifted his head, nostrils flaring. Hunger battled with hesitation. His eyes flicked to the man, searching for the catch, the trick, the strike that always followed kindness in his old life. But none came. Just the steady presence of the man, watching without demand. Finally, trembling, the dog dragged himself closer and lapped at the broth. Each swallow seemed to steady him, as though warmth itself was stitching him back together. The man nodded once, satisfied, and rose to tend to the fire. The days blurred like this, one folding into the next. Each morning, the man set broth or soft food before the dog. Each evening, he checked the bandages, his large hands surprisingly careful as he unwound the cloth, cleaned the wounds, and wrapped them anew. The dog flinched at first, every muscle tense, but the strikes never came. The rope wasn't pulled tight, the hand never closed in anger. Only patience, only persistence. Outside, winter thinned its grip on the world. Snow receded in patches, leaving the ground damp and raw, the smell of earth rising like something newly awakened. The man sometimes left the dog to rest while he split wood in the yard. His axe swung in measured arcs, thudding into the stump, the sound carrying through the cabin walls. Each strike was steady, relentless, echoing the rhythm of a life lived alone. From his blanket, the dog would listen, ears twitching, the sound oddly comforting. He didn't know why. Perhaps it was the steadiness. Perhaps it was simply that the noise meant the man was still there. At night, the fire cast shadows long across the room. The dog's dreams would drag him back into the old life. Chains shouting, the sharp crack of blows. He would whimper in his sleep, paws twitching as though running, but never fast enough. Once he woke with a yelp, scrambling to his feet in panic. The man didn't rush, he didn't shout. He rose from his chair, crouched low, and placed his hand, palm open, on the floor between them. No closer, no demand, just there. The dog panted, ribs heaving, eyes wild, but slowly the panic ebbed. Slowly, he lowered himself back to the blanket. The man stayed crouched until the dog's eyes closed again. Days turned into weeks. The wounds closed, pink scars forming where fur had been torn away. The limp softened, though it never vanished completely. The dog began to rise on his own when the man opened the door to let in fresh air, limping outside to sniff the cold wind. His ears pricked at the sound of distant crows. The world was wide, but it no longer seemed like something designed only to hurt him. The man spoke rarely, but when he did, his voice was low, gravelly, like stones rolling in a stream. Easy, he'd murmur when wrapping the paw, or good when the bowl was emptied. Just single words, planted like stones across a riverbed. And the dog, cautious as he was, began to step from one to the next, learning to cross. There were setbacks. One evening, a pan clattered to the floor, the sharp crash shattering the quiet. The dog bolted to the corner, pressing himself against the wall, tail tucked so tight it nearly disappeared. His body trembled as though every bone wanted to leap from his skin. The man froze where he stood. He didn't pick up the pan. He didn't speak. He sank slowly into the nearest chair, hands resting on his knees, and waited. Minutes passed, long, aching minutes, until finally the dog's breathing slowed, his body uncoiling inch by inch. Only then did the man move, slow and steady, to pick up the pan and set it quietly back on the counter. Trust, the man seemed to understand, was not a gift. It was a weight, and each day he carried it, without complaint, without expectation. By the end of the third week, the dog had begun to follow him, limping after the sound of boots across the porch, pausing at the doorway to watch him split wood or mend the fence. He never ventured far, but the distance between blanket and threshold grew smaller each day. And one morning, when the man crouched by the fire to stir the coals, he felt something brush against his arm. The dog's head, tentative, trembling, resting there for only a moment before pulling back. The man didn't react. He didn't reach to pet or praise. He simply let the moment hang in the air, heavy and delicate, before rising to tend to the day's work. But when he stepped outside, there was a softness in the set of his shoulders, a weight he had carried for years lifting, just enough to let him breathe. Healing had begun, not finished, not certain, but begun. And in that cabin, tucked into the edge of the woods, two broken lives stitched themselves together in silence, each breath, each small gesture a thread binding them into something neither had thought possible. The woods were waking up again. Spring pressed through the soil in green shoots, and the air carried the restless songs of birds that had been gone for months. The man spent more time outside now, mending the fence line, hauling wood from deeper in the trees, hammer echoing sharp against the stillness. The dog followed, always a few paces behind, his limp noticeable but no longer defining. He had grown stronger, ribs less pronounced, fur beginning to soften with health, but fear still lingered in his bones like a shadow he couldn't shake. One evening, as the sun sank low and painted the world in long streaks of gold, the man led the dog out into the tree line. It was a slow walk, his boots crunching over last autumn's leaves, the dog's uneven steps trailing. The air smelled of damp bark and moss, and for a while, it seemed almost peaceful. Then the growl came, low, close. Not the playful grumble of another dog, but the warning of something feral. The dog froze, every muscle locking tight. His ears pinned back, tail stiff, body crouched in a way that screamed both readiness and terror. The man turned slowly, eyes scanning the brush, and that's when he saw them. Two wild dogs, ribs sharp as knives, fur matted, eyes hungry. Survivors of some pack long forgotten, strays that had carved out their place by teeth and desperation. They had caught the scent of weakness, and now they circled. The silence of the forest shattered into snarls. The man stepped forward, putting himself between his dog and the threat, his frame squared, voice low but steadied. Back. The word wasn't shouted. It was a command waited, born of years where orders meant life or death. The strays hesitated, snarling, circling tighter. The dog behind him whimpered, paw dragging in the leaves, body trembling like old nightmares had been ripped wide open. The man reached for the branch at his feet, lifting it like a staff, his stance firm. He didn't retreat. He didn't flinch. The wild dogs lunged closer, teeth flashing in the last light of day, and that's when something broke, not in the man, but in the dog. Terror surged through him, but with it came something else, a memory of hands pulling ropes tight, of voices laughing as blows landed, of every moment where he had been forced to cower. He had always stayed small, always made himself invisible. But not this time. Not with this man standing in front of him. Not with the only steady kindness he'd ever known about to be torn apart. The growl rose in his throat before he realized it. Deep, raw, unfamiliar. His body lunged forward, weak paw dragging, but teeth bared. His bark tore through the woods, ragged but fierce, startling even himself. He planted himself at the man's side, head low, tail stiff, daring the strays to come closer. The wild dogs faltered. Hunger made them bold, but this sudden defiance from what had looked broken, gave them pause. The man didn't look at the dog, didn't speak. He simply adjusted his grip on the branch and held his ground. The three of them stood locked in a circle of breath and growl, the forest holding its breath. Minutes stretched. Finally, the strays backed away, snapping once before turning, melting into the underbrush with one last echo of teeth. Silence returned, heavy, ringing in the ears. The dog collapsed first, his legs folding under him, sides heaving. His body shook with adrenaline, with exhaustion, but his eyes stayed fixed on where the threat had gone. The man dropped the branch, crouched beside him, and for the first time his hand didn't hover. It landed firm and grounding against the dog's scarred back. "Good," he whispered. Just that single word, but it held everything. Gratitude, relief. The dog leaned into it, head pressing against the man's knee, and something shifted between them, something no silence, no waiting, no careful distance had quite managed. This was not just survival. This was trust forged in fire, a bond written in the language of danger and choice. When they walked back to the cabin, the dog stayed closer than ever, brushing against the man's leg as though afraid that if he drifted even an inch, the world might swallow him whole. The man didn't push him away. He let the contact remain step after step until the porch came into view. That night the fire burned low, and the cabin held a different kind of quiet. The dog didn't curl far from the chair this time. He lay close, so close his paws brushed the man's boots. His breathing was uneven at first, the remnants of fear still rattling his chest, but eventually it slowed, deepened, softened into something that sounded almost like peace. The man leaned back, eyes fixed on the flames, his jaw unclenched, his shoulders lowered. For the first time in years, maybe longer, the weight inside him eased. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was whole. And outside, in the dark woods, the world went on. But in that cabin, in that moment, two lives had turned a corner. They had faced the fire together, and both had chosen not to run. Summer came slowly, as if the earth itself had been cautious about returning warmth to this corner of the world. The cabin's porch, once dusted with frost, now smelled of sun, warmed pine. Grass pushed through the cracks in the gravel drive, and the trees thickened their canopy until the sky was only glimpsed in shards of blue between the leaves. Life, in quiet ways, had returned. So had the dog. The limp never fully vanished. He carried it the way the man carried the scar that split across his brow, not as weakness, but as memory. But the rest of him transformed. His fur grew in thick and soft, his ribs hidden beneath new weight. His eyes, once hollowed out, had filled again, not with blind trust, but with a sharp, searching brightness, as though he was finally curious about a world that had only ever harmed him before. He began to follow the man everywhere, out into the fields, where cicadas droned under the hot sun, down to the creek, where the man knelt to fill buckets and the dog splashed awkwardly in the shallows, pawing at his own reflection. Into town even, where whispers still followed the man like shadows. People stared at the limp dog at his heel, at the man's silence, but no one asked questions. Perhaps they knew better. Perhaps they saw in the dog's steady loyalty an answer no words could give. It was in the small rituals that the silent oath between them grew strongest. Each morning, the man filled the bowl without fail, setting it on the porch with the same precision he once used for loading a rifle. Each evening, the dog lay by the fire, his head now resting on the man's boot without hesitation. And when nightmares came, as they still did, for both, the dog's low whimpers were answered not with shouts or shaking, but with the man's hand, placed firm against his side until the trembling passed. The bond didn't need speech. It was written in presence. One afternoon, when the sun was high and the forest hummed with hidden life, the man took the dog deeper into the woods than ever before. The air was thick with the smell of pine and damp moss, cicadas buzzing like electricity. They walked in silence, boots and paws sinking into the soft earth until they reached a clearing. The grass bent low in the wind, and the sky stretched wide above them. The man stopped. He crouched, his knees creaking, and looked at the dog. No words passed. He simply removed the rope. For weeks he had kept it loosely tied, not pulling, not restraining, but they're all the same, a thin thread between them. Now, with one tug of the knot, it fell away. The dog blinked, staring at the rope in the man's hand, then at the open field. His body trembled with uncertainty. Freedom had never been kind to him. Freedom had meant cold nights, hunger, teeth, and chains. The field stretched wide and terrifying, and for a heartbeat, he hesitated. The man didn't urge. He didn't whistle. He simply stood, rope hanging from his hand, waiting. Then something broke open. The dog bolted. Not away, but forward. His limp was still there, but it didn't matter. His legs carried him across the grass, his ears flying back, his chest heaving with effort that looked like joy. He stumbled once, rolled into the dirt, then sprang up again, shaking himself off, bounding in crooked circles that carved laughter into the silence of the woods. The man watched. His face didn't smile, not in the way most would. But his eyes softened, the hard edges melting, and when the dog returned, tongue lolling, body panting, pressing himself against the man's legs as though to say, "I came back," the man dropped to one knee and placed his hand firmly on the dog's back. Not as possession, not as claim, but as promise. This was the oath, silent, wordless, unshakable. The seasons rolled on, leaves turned gold and fell, carpeting the porch. Snow returned, though this time the cabin felt warmer, fuller, as two lives burning together gave off more heat than one alone ever could. And always, in every shift of the world, the man and the dog remained side by side. There were still scars. The dog startled at loud noises, though he no longer fled. The man sometimes woke with clenched fists, his chest heaving as though battles long past still raged in his sleep. But when those moments came, neither was alone. The dog's head would find the man's hand. The man's hand would steady the dog's trembling. Two survivors, bound not by what had been done to them, but by what they had chosen to stay. One evening, years after that day in the auction barn, the man sat on the porch as the sun set fire to the horizon. His hair had silvered at the edges, his hands rougher still. The dog lay beside him, muzzle now dusted with grey, eyes half closed in contentment. The air smelled of wood smoke and damp grass, the sky painted in colors too beautiful to last. The man raised his hand, the same hand that once lifted silently in a crowded barn, the hand that had shifted everything. He laid it gently on the dog's back, feeling the steady rise and fall of breath. And in that moment, there was nothing left to say. Just the quiet oath between them, carried in silence, sealed in scars, eternal in its simplicity. I chose you. You chose me, and that is enough. Winter had returned, laying its quiet blanket over the hills. The cabin roof sagged beneath the soft burden of snow, smoke curling into the pale sky, and the air outside held that fragile silence that only comes when the world is frozen still. Inside, the fire crackled low, casting flickering light across the walls, painting both man and dog in shades of amber and shadow. The years had left their mark on both of them. The man's hair had silver threaded through it now, his shoulders slower to rise from the chair. The dog's muzzle, once dark and sharp, had grown soft and grey at the edges, his steps slower, his limp more pronounced. And yet, the bond between them had not weakened with time. It had deepened, settled into something steady, like the heartbeat you don't notice until it falters. That evening, the dog lay curled close to the fire, warmth soaking into his bones. His breathing came softer now, each inhale a little shallower, each exhale a little longer. The man watched him from the chair, book unopened on his lap, his eyes lingering on the steady rhythm of the animal's chest. He could sense it, not as fear, not as dread, but as truth. Time, the one thing even love couldn't tame, was drawing close. He leaned forward, knees creaking, and lowered himself onto the rug beside the dog. The wood was cold beneath his palms, the heat of the fire brushing against his face. Slowly, he reached out, resting his hand on the familiar curve of the dog's back. The fur was coarse now, thinner than it had been, but it was still him. The same weight that had leaned against him in the field. The same warmth that had pressed against his knee after fear had broken. The same soul he had chosen on that day, when silence was louder than the world. The dog stirred faintly, opening his eyes. For a moment, those eyes, the same eyes that once held nothing but defeat, looked back at him. And there, even through the fog of years and exhaustion, was something unshakable: trust. Not the fragile trust of survival, but the solid, unwavering trust of a life shared. The dog pressed his head weakly against the man's hand, as though sealing their silent oath once more. I came back. I stayed. I was yours, and you were mine. The fire crackled, sparks lifting into the chimney. Outside, the snow fell heavier, muffling the world. The man whispered, not loudly, not for anyone else, but for the creature whose ears had learned to listen for meaning, not just sound. You're home. You always were. His voice broke there, not in grief, but in gratitude. Gratitude for the years stolen from fate, for the nights of silence shared, for the mornings of unspoken companionship. The dog's breathing slowed, chest rising with effort, falling with surrender. The man stayed there unmoving, his hand steady, offering the one thing he had always given: presence. No force, no fear, just a hand that never left. When the final breath came, it was quiet, gentle, like a flame flickering once before it rests. The cabin held stillness then, the kind that feels sacred. The man bowed his head, eyes closing, letting the silence hold him the way he had once held the dog's silence all those years ago. Later, beneath the oak tree at the edge of the field, The man dug into the frozen earth. The work was slow, each strike of the shovel sinking into the silence of the night. When it was done, he laid the dog down on a worn blanket, the same one that had been set by the fire so long ago. He knelt there for a long time, snow gathering on his shoulders, breath hanging heavy in the cold air. He placed his hand on the mound of earth, fingers pressing against the soil, as though it were still fur beneath his touch. The moon hung high, pale against the black sky, and the fields stretched wide, endless, empty yet not lonely. Because though the dog was gone, the silence between them remained. The same silence that had begun in a crowded barn, the same silence that had carried them through years of healing and scars. It was not empty silence, it was full. Full of memory, full of presence, full of everything words had never been able to hold. When the man rose and turned back toward the cabin, his steps were heavy, but his chest did not feel hollow. The fire inside still burned. The chair still waited, and in that space by the hearth, though empty now, lived a story no one could erase. A story of a hand raised in silence, a choice made without words, and a love that needed none. And as he closed the door behind him, the last thing he whispered into the still air was the same truth he had always known: I chose you. You chose me. And that is forever.